5 years on from the first COVID lockdown, and how badly has it affected the nation's children? We're going to be speaking to a head teacher who says that they're coming into primary school completely unprepared.
He calls schools now the fourth emergency service. Well, 5 years on, we are still living with the hangover of the COVID lockdowns. Everyone, of course, made huge sacrifices, but it could be the children born at that time who will suffer the most enduring consequences. In recent months, we've seen report after report which shows that reception-age children are starting school far behind in their development milestones.
Yes, take that one by the early years charity Kindred Squared, which found that a third of children, goodness me, starting reception in September 2024 were not school ready. A quarter weren't even toilet trained. About a third struggled to hold a pencil or crayon or couldn't respond to a simple instruction. And staggeringly, 28% couldn't use a book, which doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't know how to read it, but actually opening it. And in many cases, and we're going to discuss this with the head teacher we're just about to speak to, it's partly COVID, Kamal, but I think it's also smartphone and technology use by increasingly younger children.
Yes, more than half of teachers blame too much time spent on screens. You've probably got to feel a bit for parents, haven't you? Suddenly you're in this situation where your children were at home all day, every day, and you're just trying to desperately find something to give them, to keep them entertained. You're probably possibly working, or you're going to have a lot more that you're going to be dealing with, maybe sick relatives and your own parents, etc., etc. So you can have a bit of sympathy for parents. And we know that it must have led to an explosion in smartphone and iPad use. Well, Mungo Sheppard, he's the head teacher at Ash Green Primary School near Halifax, joins us now on the Daily Tea. You've been at the school for 28 years, Mungo, and head teacher for 16 years. It's an area of high deprivation. And of this year's reception cohort, born between September 2019 and August 2020, 30% were in nappies on entry to nursery and 15% on entry to reception. Thanks so much, Mungo Sheppard, for joining us. Mungo, what has been the difference between your youngest pupils coming into your school pre and post COVID?
The COVID pandemic clearly was an incredibly difficult time to lead a school and for the children who were in school, but it's only over the last couple of years that we're seeing the real impact on the children who were born during that time. And I think for children all over the country, the lack of socialisation that they were able to have with others has clearly had a huge impact on their not only speech and language skills, but things like turn taking, ability to play, understand empathy and all manner of things like that. And you've also got to look at the angle that the parents themselves, I'm a parent, lots of us are parents who up until that year would have all manner of different groups to attend with each other to try and find out advice from each other, but just even little networking opportunities over at the park or calling around at one another's houses. That didn't happen, so parents didn't really know what kind of job they were doing, if they were doing a good job. And as you've alluded to just before I came on then, the sort of boom in technology and so on, not only as that's grown, but almost as a pacifier sometimes. You can understand that in those situations for some of those parents as well. It's like, well, if I'm on my own here with a couple of kids in a flat and I don't really know if I'm doing the right thing or the wrong thing, what am I going to provide my children as a link to the world? It's probably going to be a smartphone or a tablet if they actually can't see people themselves. So it's a complete lack of a lot of skills that children prior to that would have had that they therefore didn't have.
Mungo, can we get these children up to speed and prepared for secondary school? It's so interesting to speak to you today because I was at an event on Friday night. It was a retirement do of an MP I've known for a long time, and a local secondary school head was there. This is in Hertfordshire. And he was saying that from a secondary school perspective, he has been warned that these so-called COVID kids who are now in reception, 5 years on from the first lockdown, are going to be problematic coming into year 7. And I'm wondering, what are you doing at primary school level to try and catch up, really?
It's a really good question. And I think, yes, we can, but it's going to be much more difficult. I think there needs to be some serious consideration about the curriculum and what it is that we're asking of children. Because your colleague and friend there as a secondary school head teacher will probably have their own ideas about the sorts of skills that are going to be important for coming into secondary school, but maybe some of the things that are less important that traditionally in primary schools we know how important a broad and balanced curriculum is, and it remains a broad and balanced curriculum is very important. But there's an understanding from us that we're going to have to streamline and slim down some elements of a broader curriculum to make sure that children have got absolutely the right levels of skills they're going to need at secondary school and through life. So unfortunately, that's meaning that we're having to put ever more emphasis on a lot of the basic skills through primary school. We certainly don't want to turn into 3 hours at all, far from that. But we know that unless we've got our children who are able to sit for longer periods of time, write with stamina, be able to infer meaning, all the things that they're going to need to do to be able to research and apply knowledge in secondary school, that might be that we have to slim down some of the things that we've traditionally done. So we're not going to stop teaching art and design and geography and all these incredible things, of course we're not, but we are having to be quite selective about what we do teach. And I think for us, and I'm sure your secondary colleague will recognise this, the huge amount of work that's happening is at the other end of school. When we're looking at school readiness, and you talked at the beginning about self-care skills, children's ability to interact, to speak, to do up their own coats, to toilet themselves, we are realising ever more with every term that comes that we're having to put a lot of those skills in ourselves as soon as children come to school, which is meaning that you can't make the same level of progress just as quickly, for example, towards a traditional good level of development at the end of early years. It's not that helpful for schools when targets are being set at ministerial level. About 75% of children will get a good level of development, because how on earth can they do that in reception when we're also talking about when they come into nursery or come into reception? A lot of schools don't have nurseries. First of all, we're having to teach these children basic self-care skills and the ability to hold conversations and to be able to sit up straight and to be able to learn all the skills that are pre-writing and pre-reading. So there's got to be an acceptance that children are not going to achieve traditional age-related expectations as young as they used to do. We will try and get that journey so the children, by the time they leave Key Stage 2 and go to Key Stage 3 to your friend's school, that they have caught up as best they can. But there will have to be an acceptance as well that there'll be some things that won't have taken place just as well for that to happen. So it's a difficult position we're all in, and I do think I totally agree with your point. I've spoken to secondary colleagues and said, be aware there are going to be more children coming through with special educational needs, disabilities, social and emotional mental health issues. They will have had a lot more speech and language interventions before they come. And it will be very interesting. I probably won't be around to see it, but it will be very interesting to see how this age of children pan out through secondary school, and what curriculum changes are made along the way, and what allowances are made for understanding that these children are coming in lower than before.
Given what you've just outlined, do you think that we understood enough when the government decided to close down schools, not just once, but over and over again, and for pretty lengthy periods? Did we understand enough what the impact was going to be? And if you could make those decisions again, do you think that we should have done much more to keep schools open?
That's a really difficult question, because you're quite right. There's no doubt that the lockdowns and children being away from school had a fairly catastrophic effect, not only on their learning, but definitely on socialisation and definitely on parenting. I think the country was clearly not prepared at all for a pandemic of that extent. I think we've all seen that now. If you had your time again, I think the stage where we got to in the second lockdown, schools were much more prepared, in terms of the remote learning that they'd got in place, the lessons that they learned from the first lockdown. I would like to think that if we would have been more prepared in the country, if schools still did have to lock down and shut, that the children would have had a better education whilst at home. I still don't think that would have undone a lot of the things that we spoke about before, the lack of movement and mobility from place to place. It's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think you can answer it, because there's no doubt if schools are open, then children are going to do an awful lot better. The difficulty, of course, was the wisdom at the time was that if schools remained open, then that was going to make sure that the pandemic would run amok much more. If we'd have had a vaccine from the word go, and if we'd have been prepared as a country, maybe with a better infrastructure in terms of health, and then you felt that this was something that we could have, mitigated better, that's probably a better word, then yes, of course, it would have been better for schools to remain open. But I think the fact that schools had to close, if we're really honest about this as school leaders, just like leaders in every sector, I don't think anyone was well enough prepared for just how catastrophic that would be. You know, I've got children who are secondary school age. Well, they've left secondary school now, and you know, for children of that age, it was very, very difficult. But that said, you know, remote lessons and so on was something that were already probably a part of secondary school and further education. I think for primary children, it was so difficult to think how we could
Mm.
keep children engaged and keep them learning at such a young age. And that was just one part of it. Obviously, the wider societal things that were happening have obviously had a huge impact because that's now knocked onto all sorts of needs. You know,
Yeah.
attendance has gone down greatly. You'll know that. You know, there's been a real shift in the way that people have looked at that. I think for years, you know, we would advocate that even if children were not particularly well, you know, only feeling 70% or something, get yourself into school. To then go from that to being told with a positive test for this, or you know, with symptoms for that, you need to be at home. That's had a real knock on children. And also, you've got the fact that a lot of children who were secondary school age then almost got lost in the system. We ended up with so many more children who were electively home educated, not attending. And then what we see in our community, unfortunately, is the legacy of that. So younger siblings then, oh, our so and so didn't go to school, or they didn't go to school.
Yeah.
You know, and trying to get those children back for that. It's so wide ranging, and I suppose a simple answer to the initial part of your question about did we really know what was going to happen as a result? No, we didn't. There are there are direct and indirect effects, and we're going to be feeling them, I think, for a long time.
Mungo, can I ask you about the issue of parental responsibility? Because you've listed a number of things there and some deficiencies in some of the children that are coming into you at reception and nursery level. And the counter narrative to that is we've heard from Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, about quite a lot of sort of state intervention on some of these issues. The breakfast clubs, because children aren't turning up to school in the morning with full stomachs. The teeth brushing that is apparently being carried out by some teachers because, again, parents aren't necessarily looking after their children's dental care enough. You've mentioned there children that just dropped off the register during lockdown, and then subsequently it seemed to be acceptable for siblings to not attend school that religiously. To me, this all seems as if parents are in some way abrogating some of their responsibility. Maybe being able to use COVID as an excuse, but we have to hold children's parents responsible for how well they're prepared for school, don't we?
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act. I think the points you've made are all good ones. We we've got to draw the line, haven't we, somewhere between poverty and neglect as well. We talk about that an awful lot in terms of safeguarding in schools. Yeah, I think speaking to colleagues recently, I think school readiness is this huge area at the moment. I think we can help parents. We can probably tell them a lot more about the skills that they do need to work on with their children now that we're post COVID and some of those prohibitive factors are no longer there. I think it will be very helpful for parents if they had more idea, just like your secondary colleague, knowing what we could tell them about what children are going to have and they're not going to have. But I do think, yeah, there is a level of responsibility too, because some of these things are not to do with poverty, they're not to do with COVID. You know, I would expect that parents are encouraging their children to be toilet trained, to brush their own teeth, to put their own coats on, to sit for longer periods of time, to engage children in conversation. I think that's something that's not to do with class or deprivation. That's just something that we've massively lost in society. I drive past, I go and work with other schools, and yes, I'm in an area serving high deprivation, but I'm also supporting a school at the moment in an area of that affluence is perhaps too strong a point, but certainly with very few children on pupil premium. But I will still see parents and carers walking down streets on mobile phones from the word go while children just take them on. And I think the difference there, I was fortunate enough on a handful of days to take my own daughters to school, sliding a shift. And I used to look forward to walking and talking to them and explaining about things that are going on in the world and even testing them on the spellings and so on. I'm not saying that there aren't parents like that, but I think there are a lot of parents now who are forgetting about that side of things. And yeah, That's not to do with class. It's not to do with poverty. It's unfortunate. I do think there are some mitigating factors for parents who are really up against it at the moment. And I think initiatives like breakfast clubs are fantastic because you can have the best parent in the world who doesn't have enough money, and of course they will prioritise their child. And we see that here, that our parents will make sure that the children eat even if they don't. And I think it's very important that where we can as a state support that, we do. Again, within reason, there are some wonderful things happening. We work with Magic Breakfast at our school at the moment, which means we're able to offer, free bagels. This is before the government scheme now. To every child who comes into school, we can make sure, from our kitchens, we batch cook soup and so on to send things home. We have holiday activities, food camp in every single holiday throughout the school year, because none of these issues are the children's fault. So you're quite right. Parents do need to take on greater responsibility. Where possible, we as schools and everybody else in the public sector need to also support families where they need support, because the bottom line is none of these children asked for there to be a pandemic, and none of these children also asked to be born perhaps in times where they didn't have enough food to eat, close to where warm, dry places to be. So schools have become very much the fourth emergency service over the last decade or so, I would say anyway. I think one of the real sad side effects really of the austerity agenda in the last decade or so has been that a lot of services around schools have gone. And particularly when you look at an area like mine, where you used to have a really thriving sort of sure start children's centre, you'd have agencies coming into schools like educational psychology, behaviour support, speech and language. Most of those things have now gone. So schools are having to take on more and more. And perhaps that's also highlighting that maybe some parents need to do more as well, because perhaps other agencies used to be able to do more too. And if schools aren't able to provide that and parents aren't able to provide that, then unfortunately it's our poor children who suffer. And as we all know, we've been around long enough, these children, the workers of tomorrow. And if we're trying to create a society where people want to work hard and have got enough and so on, that's going to knock on into next generations too. So difficult times, and certainly the last 5 years have been a real challenge in schools.
Mungo Sheppard, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea. Let's make sure that your expertise and others like you is listened to by the COVID inquiry, and that some lessons are learnt from what we all went through 5 years ago. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Listening to that, I was just thinking back to my maternity leaves. I had the monkey music in my head. I had the theme tune to monkey music. Was this music class that I took?
After my time as a young parent of young
monkey music. Anyway, it was big in Kingston upon Thames at the time. Take the babies to this church hall, meet other mums, socialise the children. I mean, they were just very, very little in those days. And then as they became toddlers, they used to love going dancing and singing. And it was a way of just, having some company, because actually once you have a baby, and particularly if you've been a career woman, quite a lonely place to have a baby. And then to think about doing that in lockdown and not being able to see anyone, and not being able to get together with other mums to discuss things like, why isn't my child breastfeeding? Why isn't my child sitting up? Why isn't my child weaning properly? And all that stuff. It did create a different environment for people having babies at that time.
Real creation of loneliness. I remember being on holiday last year, and in the house next door to where we were staying were a husband and wife who were teachers, and they said that the behaviour of parents had completely changed pre and post COVID. Much ruder. The behaviour of children was much more erratic, much more aggressive, because not only would parents not know how to teach children at home for hours and hours and hours on end, but they wouldn't really know how to sort of keep what you might describe as discipline. So it was the children's behaviour not in structured places meant that their behaviour declined.
Yeah.
And also you're so struck, I live in London, where you are cheek by jowl, rich people with people who are much, much poorer. And just travelling around the empty streets of London through those lockdowns, you realise that people who are living in flats or, with hardly any space, no outdoor space, with children trapped in their bedrooms, No wonder they spent hour after hour after hour on anything that they could be given by the parents to keep them in some way occupied.
But this is why at the time I argued school should never have been closed. I know lots of people are now coming forward and saying, well, with the benefit of hindsight, you're saying that now. Throughout that whole period, the institutions I argued should have stayed open were schools, because I felt that the priority should have been children and the elderly. And of course, the teaching unions were making very valid points about the safety of teachers, and you couldn't expose teachers to the disease and all the rest of it. But at the time, I remember looking it up, the average age of a teacher was 32. So they weren't in the bracket that were going to be harmed necessarily. And I appreciate we now know more about COVID than we did then. But I remember at the time thinking, this is going to be so harmful. And the Telegraph featured the campaign group Us for Them and others. And very few people at the time, and it's all very well for people to rewrite history now, were saying, but what about the children? What about the children? Do you remember when the COVID inquiry was set up and it wasn't actually going to look at children at all? And on this newspaper and others, we had to campaign and said, are you joking? You're not going to look at the impacts on that generation. And we spoke about it earlier. You know, your daughter was impacted because she was at university. My children were making that transition between primary and secondary, never got any kind of end of year thing, never went into secondary really, I think probably in retrospect unprepared, not mature enough, not able to sort of cope initially in those first months. It's tricky, but I just don't ever think school should have been closed. That was always my opinion.
And also the years and years and years we're going to have to wait for the COVID inquiry to actually report, which takes us round, doesn't it? Which takes us round full circle, Camilla, about is Britain broken? As you say, you and I don't like that narrative too much. But the fact that this lengthy inquiry is going to go on and on and on is all linked to something within the country's ability to get things done.
Now, it's a big week this week because we've got Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor's spring statement on Wednesday, and tomorrow we'll be back at 5 p.m. to have a look at what might be in that quite seminal, I would say, economic announcement.